The total cost of the 2022 federal midterm elections is projected to exceed $9.3 billion. But what do we get from what must surely be the most expensive electoral system on the planet? There's little real choice. The dismantling of our democracy, which took place over the last few decades on behalf of corporations and the rich, has been a bipartisan project, leaving only the outward shell of democracy. The courts, legislative bodies, the executive branch, and the media, including public broadcasting, are captive to corporate power. There is no institution left that can be considered authentically democratic. The corporate coup d'etat is over. They won, we lost. The wreckage of this corporate coup is appalling. Endless and futile wars to enrich a military, industrial complex that bleeds the U.S. Treasury of half of all discretionary spending, deindustrialization that has turned U.S. cities into decayed ruins, the slashing and privatization of social programs, including education, utility services, and healthcare, which saw over 1 million Americans account for 1/5 of global deaths from COVID, although we are 4% of the world's population. Draconian forms of social control embodied in militarized police, functioning as lethal armies of occupation in poor urban areas, the largest prison system in the world, a virtual tax boycott by the richest individuals and corporations, money-saturated elections that perpetuate our system of legalized bribery, and the most intrusive state surveillance of the citizenry in our history. How are we to interpret these elections, which will create even more political paralysis with Republican control of the House? And what should we expect in the next presidential election? Joining me to discuss the political landscape in the wake of the midterm elections is former presidential candidate and consumer advocate Ralph Nader. You can find him at ralphnader.substack.com. Ralph, let's begin with the midterms. It wasn't the blowout of the Democratic Party that many expected. How do you interpret what happened?
Well, coming off the list that you just described about the situation in this country and its impact on the world, my first reaction was there are 535 people in the Congress who could change it all. And they don't all have to be unanimous. It could just be a plurality or a majority of members. So what are we waiting for? Check off your entire list, Chris. And we got the votes. The corporations don't have the votes. They have money, but the members of Congress want the money to get the votes against their primary or general election opponents. So it just is very intriguing that people thrash around groaning, moaning, being sickened, injured, blocked, discriminated against, deprived, and they don't focus on the Khyber Pass, which is Congress. Whether we like it or not, that's the institution that has the greatest authority to take on these big corporations and take on the predators and to drive peace in the world instead of war and empire. And we're listening to all these recountings of the ailments and injustices and the brutish scenarios coming up in the future with climate disruption and reneging on any kind of compact with posterity. And we don't focus on Congress. And so, the midterm election, they're running around the campaigns like they're ward bosses. We're going to fix this pothole here, and we're going to make sure that there's a public service there. And instead of looking at the big picture of the concentration of power, they're doing this piecemeal retail assurances of the public, which of course drives the expectation of the people even lower. And when you drive the expectation lower as to what members of Congress running for election or challengers running to defeat them, when you control those expectations at such a low level, the members of Congress get away with their responsibility for the country under the Constitution. We, the people, they're the ones who get the taxing power in Congress, the spending power, the confirmation of judges and official power, the right not to go to war. Just there's no end to it. So I keep saying, if all of these efforts for justice around the country, small, large, national, local, do not focus on Congress and the state legislatures and the town councils, they're going to be spinning their wheels forever as this country is driven into the ground.
I want to talk about the impediments, though. First of all, you have redistricting, so most races are not actually competitive. The Democratic Party redistrict the seat that Dennis Kucinich to drive him out. And number two, if you aren't awash in money, and you saw this in your own campaign, you were drawing crowds. I think you filled Madison Square Garden. Everybody had to pay $5 to get in. So I don't know how many thousands of people, but you didn't have access to television, which would have given you an audience of millions. So there are serious impediments to essentially breaking the power of this duopoly.
Yeah, but the impediments melt away if people organize in every congressional district to reflect the congruence of left-right opinion in this country, which is deleted from the news accounts that like to talk about polarization, red state, blue state, conservative, liberal. We know that on the fundamental necessities of life, there's a huge convergence, 70, 80, 90% in the polls. There was one poll a few years ago, Chris, 90% of people wanted to break up the big banks, 90%. You got 75% or so want universal health care, even without a major party pushing for it. And it just goes on, whether it's cracking down on corporate crooks, whether it's changing the campaign finance system, whether it's controlling what people own, like pension funds and mutual funds, which together own three-quarters of the stock of the companies on the New York and NASDAQ stock exchanges. So the people have the power, but they've allowed it to be seized because they don't do their homework back home. They don't spend time on their civic responsibilities, and they don't say to the members of Congress, hey, we're the ones who have the sovereign power. Yeah, you've got it from us, and you're using it against us, and we're not going to tolerate it anymore. So the only place where democracy comes before work is in a dictionary. And so we got to stop spinning our wheels and recounting disaster after disaster when we can control the legislative bodies, local, state, and national. Look at the initiatives in Nebraska and right-wing states. They have passed minimum wage increases against massive corporate opposition, saturating the television. Florida, Arkansas, in the one conservative state, South Dakota, the Republican-dominated legislature, the governor, and the corporations all opposed an initiative to constitutionalize Medicaid, not just to send a statute, but to put the Constitution of South Dakota. Who won? The people won because they started working. They rolled up their sleeves. Otherwise, all we're doing is documenting despair, perdition, pessimism, which discourages people and turns them into cynics, which leads to withdrawal from the political arena, and which makes the corporations laugh all the way to the bank.
I want to talk about fear because I think Matt Taibbi wrote that most Americans don't vote for what they want; they vote against the political figure they hate. The divisions, largely, as you point out, there's a majoritarian opinion on many of the issues you just cited, but there is this cultural divide, and people employ fear. Biden's own record in the Senate and even as vice president is pretty appalling. From supporting Anita Hill to, I think, 5 years before the invasion of Iraq, he talked about taking Saddam down. He, of course, has rehabilitated Mohammed bin Salman, a fervent supporter of the apartheid state in Israel. He fought school busing. He was aggressively he sponsored the 1994 crime bill and the three strikes you're out, the third violent penalty law where you can't get parole, the NAFTA, Glass-Steagall. So these are not issues that we look back on and support, but the Democrats, like the Republicans, play on this fear, the fear of, and I do see, as you do, a figure like Trump to be frightening and these fringe candidates to be frightening. But it seems that that is the primary currency at this point, of our political system.
Yeah, well, there are millions of people who don't buy it. We need tens of millions of people who don't buy it. We need people talking to one another in the neighborhoods. We need people to turn out for town meetings. There are all kinds of jurisdictions in this country that allow for the referendum to be stocked with all kinds of progressive legislation at the federal, at the state and local level. Most people don't even know about it. They don't even use it. Why? Because our schools don't begin teaching these children civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic experience learned by doing. All of this comes down to how much time do people spend to produce a deliberative democracy that wages peace and justice, equality, and foreseeing and forestalling the perils for our posterity, like climate disruption. That's what it comes down to. And if we don't address it at that level, if we don't highlight the victories of the people over powerful interests that occur from time to time in this country, we're just documenting despair, producing discouragement, producing withdrawal from the political system, and people then just dive into their own discouraging lives and watch entertainment, bet on sports. We got to turn it around. And the nice thing about this approach is you only have to turn around a supermajority of 535 people. And you know what they want more than anything else. They want to win. And that means votes. So you focus votes to nullify the effect of money. I mean, look at the victory of Summer Lee coming out of Pittsburgh. She's 32 years old, and she's going to be the next representative in the House from an area around Pittsburgh. She was opposed by corporations. She took on the dark side of the United Steelworkers. They opposed her. AIPAC put $1 million to $2 million just before the election to defeat her. She beat them all. How? She developed a grassroots coalition based on the principle that they all bleed the same color. It doesn't matter what labels they put on themselves. And she forged this coalition and beat them all. A spectacular story, which the New York Times is not spending much time reporting on. They're too obsessed with Taylor Greene, the madcap representative from Georgia, putting her on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. And they give all kinds of attention to crazy right-wing groups and institutes, and they give people the impression nothing's happened on the progressive side during the election period. So Pittsburgh, it's not. Pittsburgh is not Ann Arbor. It's not Cambridge. It has a lot of conservatives, and she beat them all. Energy. That's the civic energy is what's needed. You have people. You have like 82% of Republicans against Citizens United, which is a Supreme Court decision over a decade ago that said corporations could give unlimited money for or against candidates in elections, unlimited, and a lot of it dark money. You got over 80% of Republicans, when they're polled on that, are against it. It has to be organized. Otherwise, the divide and rule strategy of the two-party duopoly, fronting for giant corporations, will forever control the people, who are the only people who have the votes. I mean, bad as corporations are, Chris, they don't yet have the vote. Not yet, at least.